descended into darkness, polished smooth by years of careful use. Someone had been living beneath his property, and he had never known. Caleb struck a match and lowered himself into the tunnel. The flame revealed carved stone walls, wooden support beams, and the unmistakable signs of long-term habitation. This wasn't some hastily dug hiding place. This was a home built to last. That's when he saw her. Eleanor Blackwood sat in a massive chair, her 7-foot frame dwarfing the furniture around her. The giant widow of local legend. The monster who had supposedly murdered her husband before vanishing into the wilderness 12 years ago. But the woman before him didn't look like a killer. She looked utterly, heartbreakingly alone. "Please don't run," she said quietly, her voice deep but gentle. "I know what the stories say about me." The underground chamber stretched far beyond his matchlight, revealing glimpses of books, medical supplies, and personal belongings arranged with desperate care. This tomb had become someone's entire world. Eleanor stood slowly, moving with surprising grace. "Your grandfather knew I was down here. Samuel Ward was the only person who believed my story." Caleb's throat went dry. "My grandfather never mentioned you. He was protecting you," Eleanor said, moving to a wooden chest. "But now that you found me, maybe it's time you learn what really happened to your family." She unwrapped a photograph that made his blood freeze. 3 men standing together outside this very barn. One was definitely his grandfather, younger than Caleb had ever seen him. The others were strangers with faces that seemed hauntingly familiar, written on the back in his grandfather's handwriting. The partnership that destroyed everything. Samuel Ward, Thomas Blackwood, Roberto Santos. 1869. "Santos," Caleb whispered. "They erased him," Eleanor said, her voice growing hard. "Just like they tried to erase me. Just like they'll try to erase you." She led him deeper into the tunnels, her candle revealing chamber after chamber. Maps covered the walls, marked with red X's that formed a terrifying pattern across Montana territory. Dozens of X's, each marked with a name and date. 43 families, Eleanor said quietly. All dead. All refused to sell their land to the same buyers. Caleb recognized names from his childhood. The Hendersons, the Mackenzies, the Morrisons, all supposedly natural deaths or accidents. "This is impossible," he breathed. Eleanor's laugh was bitter. Who would investigate? The territorial marshal visits once a year. The sheriff's bought. The newspaper prints what they're told. She pulled out a thick ledger filled with careful documentation. "I've spent 12 years gathering evidence. But I'm a giant woman living in a hole. A monster who supposedly killed her husband." She stepped closer, her imposing presence somehow not frightening at all. "What do you want from me?" Caleb asked. "I want you to help me expose them," Eleanor said desperately. "But you need to understand what you're choosing. The men responsible are still alive, still powerful, still killing." She touched his face gently with one massive hand. "Your grandfather's death wasn't natural. They poisoned him when he got old enough to talk. Choose to help me, and you become their next target." The candle flickered between them, casting their faces in dancing light and shadow. In Eleanor's eyes, Caleb saw something that made his chest tighten. Hope. After 12 years of darkness, this remarkable woman was looking at someone with hope. "Eleanor," he said quietly. Tears ran down her strong features. "No one has said my name like that in 12 years. Like I was still human." That's when Caleb understood he had already made his choice. Not because of evidence or conspiracy or justice, but because he couldn't abandon someone who had waited so long for another human being to see her as more than a monster. The next week passed in a blur of secrets and careful planning. Every morning, Caleb worked his land as usual, repairing fences and tending livestock while neighbors waved from distant properties. But as soon as darkness fell, he would slip down into Eleanor's underground world, where candlelight revealed truths too dangerous for daylight. Eleanor had transformed herself over 12 years from a grieving widow into something far more formidable. She spoke 3 languages, had taught herself basic medicine, and possessed a sharp legal mind that could dissect territorial law with surgical precision. Her massive hands, which the town remembered only for their supposed violence, moved with delicate care as she showed him document after document. The Henderson barn fire wasn't an accident, she explained one evening, pointing to a carefully drawn map. Someone nailed the doors shut from the outside. I found the evidence the next morning, but by then the sheriff had already declared an unfortunate tragedy. Caleb studied her neat handwriting, amazed by the thoroughness of her investigation. How did you get all this information without anyone seeing you? Eleanor's smile was sad. When you're 7 feet tall and everyone believes you're dead, you become very good at moving unseen. I know every back trail, every abandoned building, every place where a giant woman can hide while she gathers proof that no one wants to hear. She led him to a different chamber, where dozens of personal items lay carefully arranged on wooden shelves. A child's doll, a man's pocket watch, a woman's wedding ring. I collected these from the crime scenes, Eleanor said quietly. Things the killers left behind because they didn't matter to anyone in power, but they mattered to the families who died. Caleb picked up the pocket watch, feeling the weight of someone's entire life in his palm. This belonged to James Mackenzie. He was trying to wind it when they poisoned his well water, Eleanor replied. Found him still holding it when I came to gather evidence. His wife was clutching their baby daughter. The underground chamber suddenly felt too small, too airless. Caleb set down the watch with trembling hands. How do you bear it, knowing all this, carrying all these stories? Eleanor's expression grew distant. Some nights I don't think I can. Some nights I sit in that chair and wonder if it would be easier to just walk out into the wilderness and let the cold take me. She turned to face him, and Caleb saw tears glistening in her eyes. But then I remembered Thomas's last words. He made me promise to keep fighting, to make sure their deaths meant something. What did he say? Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. He said, Don't let them win, Ellie. Don't let them erase us like we never existed. The candle flame flickered between them, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Caleb found himself stepping closer to this remarkable woman who had endured more than anyone should ever have to bear. You're not alone anymore, he said simply. Eleanor's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely. She collapsed to her knees, her massive frame shaking with 12 years of suppressed grief. I've been so afraid, she sobbed. So afraid that I was losing my mind down here, that maybe the stories were true, that maybe I really was a monster. Caleb knelt beside her, struck by how vulnerable someone so physically powerful could seem. You're the strongest person I've ever met, and you're definitely not a monster. How can you be so sure? Eleanor asked, looking up at him with desperate hope. Because monsters don't spend 12 years collecting evidence to protect other people, Caleb replied firmly. Monsters don't build shrines to remember victims that everyone else forgot. Monsters don't cry when they talk about children who never got to grow up. Eleanor reached out tentatively, as if afraid he might pull away. When Caleb took her enormous hand in both of his, she let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I never thought I would feel human touch again, she whispered. You deserve so much more than just touch, Caleb said, surprising himself with the intensity of his words. You deserve justice. You deserve peace. You deserve to be seen for the incredible woman you are. Eleanor's eyes widened. Caleb, you don't understand what you're saying. I'm not. I can't. Look at me. Really look at me. I am looking at you, he replied without hesitation. I see someone who turned 12 years of isolation into 12 years of preparation. Someone who could have become bitter and broken, but chose to fight for people she'll never meet. Someone who's been protecting an entire territory from killers, even though no one knows or cares. He stood and helped her to her feet, marveling at how perfectly her hand fit in despite the size difference. I see the most remarkable woman I've ever encountered. And I see someone I'm already falling in love with. The words hung in the candlelit air between them, like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Eleanor stared at him with an expression of wonder and terror. You can't love me, she whispered. Everyone who loves me dies. It's a curse, Caleb. I bring death to anyone who gets close. That's not a curse, Caleb said firmly. That's what they want you to believe. They want you isolated, afraid, convinced that caring about anyone is dangerous. Because as long as you believe that, you'll never trust anyone enough to expose their crimes. He cupped her face gently in his hands. But I'm not afraid of them, Eleanor. And I'm not afraid of you. I'm only afraid of walking away and leaving you alone in the darkness for another 12 years. Eleanor closed her eyes and leaned into his touch. If we do this, if we try to expose them together, they'll come for both of us. They'll make our deaths look like accidents, just like all the others. Then we better make sure we're ready for them, Caleb replied. When Eleanor opened her eyes, something had changed in her expression. The hopelessness was gone, replaced by determination, and something else that made Caleb's heart race. Love. For the first time in 12 years, Eleanor Blackwood was allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved to be loved back. 3 days later, Eleanor made a decision that changed everything. She was going to leave the tunnels. I can't keep hiding, she told Caleb as they sat together in her underground chamber, sharing a simple meal by candlelight. For 12 years, I've been gathering evidence, documenting crimes, building a case that no one will ever see because I'm too afraid to step into the light. Caleb felt his stomach tighten with worry. Eleanor, if someone sees you, if word gets back to the wrong people, then we deal with it together, she interrupted, reaching across the small table to take his hand. You said you weren't afraid of them. You said you weren't afraid of me. Did you mean it? The question hung between them like a challenge. Caleb looked into her eyes and saw not just love, but a desperate need to reclaim her life from the shadows that had claimed it for too long. I meant every word, he said firmly. But we need a plan. We can't just walk into town and hope for the best. Eleanor's smile was fierce. I've had 12 years to think about this moment. I know exactly what we're going to do. She led him to a chamber he'd never seen before, where detailed maps of the surrounding territory covered every surface. Red lines connected various properties, showing patterns of ownership that told a story of systematic land acquisition through violence. The Cattlemen's Association is meeting next week to discuss new railroad contracts, Eleanor explained, pointing to a circled date on a calendar. Every man responsible for those 43 murders will be in the same room at the same time. Caleb studied the maps, understanding dawning on him slowly. You want to confront them publicly. I want to present evidence that they can't deny or dismiss. Eleanor corrected. Witness testimony, documentation, physical proof of their conspiracy, in front of enough people that they can't make us disappear quietly. She pulled out a leather portfolio filled with documents that represented 12 years of meticulous investigation. But I need someone they'll listen to. Someone whose family name carries weight in the territory. The Ward name means something to these people, Caleb admitted reluctantly. My grandfather was respected, even feared by some. Because he knew their secrets, Eleanor said, and now you do too. That night, as they prepared for what might be their last peaceful evening together, Eleanor showed Caleb something that made his heart break. Hidden in the deepest part of her underground home was a collection of items that told the story of the woman she had been before tragedy reshaped her life. Teaching certificates from the school where she had worked before marriage, love letters from Thomas, filled with words of devotion and dreams of the future they would build together. A child's cradle, carefully carved but never used. We were going to have children, Eleanor said quietly, running her hands over the smooth wood. Thomas made this himself. Spent months getting every detail perfect. We had names picked out, a room prepared in our house. She looked up at Caleb with tears in her eyes. I used to imagine what they would look like, whether they'd have his gentle nature or my stubborn streak, whether they'd be tall like me or normal size like him. Caleb knelt beside the cradle, understanding the full scope of what had been stolen from this remarkable woman, not just her husband, not just her freedom, but her entire future. You could still have children, he said softly. When this is over, when we've exposed the truth, you could have the life you dreamed of. Eleanor's laugh was sad. With who? What man would want a giant widow with a reputation for murder? What man would want children who might grow up to be freaks like their mother? I would, Caleb said without hesitation. The word seemed to echo in the underground chamber, hanging in the air between them like a promise. Eleanor stared at him with an expression of complete shock. Caleb, you don't know what you're saying. You've known me for a week. You don't understand what life with me would mean. I understand that I love you, he replied firmly. I understand that you're the strongest, most intelligent, most courageous woman I've ever met. I understand that any children we had would be lucky to inherit even half of your remarkable qualities. Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth. You're talking about marriage, about a future, about things that can't happen. Why can't they happen? Because look at me. Eleanor stood abruptly, her full height making the chamber seem suddenly small. I'm a giant, Caleb. I'm 7 feet tall and stronger than most men. I've lived in a hole for 12 years. I have the blood of 43 families on my conscience because I couldn't save them. She gestured to the evidence surrounding them. This is my world. Death and documentation and darkness. You can't possibly want to tie your life to someone like me. Caleb stood and walked to her, unintimidated by her size or her fears. Eleanor, you're right. I can't possibly want to tie my life to someone like you. Her face crumpled with pain, but before she could speak, he continued. I don't want to tie my life to someone like you. I want to tie my life to you, not because of what you look like or how tall you are or where you've been living, but because of who you are. He reached up to cup her face in his hands. You're not responsible for those deaths. You're the only person who cared enough to document them, to remember them, to fight for justice on their behalf. You're not a giant who happens to be a woman. You're a woman who happens to be extraordinary in every possible way. Eleanor's tears came freely now, 12 years of isolation and self-doubt finally breaking apart under the force of unconditional acceptance. If we survive what's coming, Caleb continued, if we expose these killers and live to see justice done, I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you deserve every happiness you've been denied. Eleanor pulled him into an embrace that lifted him completely off his feet. For a moment, suspended in her powerful arms, Caleb felt like he was flying. I love you too, she whispered against his ear, and that terrifies me more than any conspiracy or threat we might face. Good, Caleb replied, because the best things in life are usually the most frightening. As they held each other in a candlelit chamber, surrounded by evidence of past horrors and plans for future justice, both of them understood that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Tomorrow, they would step into the light together, and whatever happened next, they would face it as partners in every sense of the word. The Cattlemen's Association meeting was packed tighter than a church on Sunday. Every powerful rancher, businessman, and territorial official within 100 miles had gathered in the largest building in town to discuss the new railroad contracts that would make fortunes for those positioned to benefit. Caleb and Eleanor waited outside in the cold Montana air, both of them breathing vapor clouds that disappeared into the star-filled sky. Eleanor wore her finest dress, her hair braided elegantly, but nothing could disguise her extraordinary height or the nervous energy radiating from her massive frame. Once we walk through that door, there's no going back, she said quietly. Are you absolutely certain about this? Caleb took her enormous hand in both of his, marveling at how right it felt despite everything that made it impossible. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. They walked into the crowded hall together, and the effect was immediate and electric. Conversations died mid-sentence. Men who had been laughing and drinking fell silent. Every eye in the room turned to stare at the giant woman who had supposedly been dead for 12 years. Eleanor stood perfectly straight, using her full height to command the room's attention. When she spoke, her voice carried easily to every corner of the building. My name is Eleanor Blackwood, she announced. Many of you remember me. Some of you have been telling stories about me for 12 years. Tonight, I'm here to tell you the truth. Marcus Cross, the wealthiest cattleman in the territory, stood from his seat near the front. This woman is a killer and a mad woman. She murdered her husband and should be in chains, not addressing decent people. I have evidence, Eleanor replied calmly, producing her leather portfolio. 12 years of documentation proving that my husband, Thomas Blackwood, was murdered by a conspiracy of men in this very room. She began laying out photographs, documents, and witness testimonies on the nearest table. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by curiosity despite their fear and prejudice. Roberto Santos discovered silver on what is now the Ward property in 1869. Eleanor continued. My husband and Samuel Ward agreed to help him establish legal claims. When Santos refused offers to buy his discovery, he was murdered and buried in secret. The room erupted in angry voices, but Eleanor's commanding presence gradually restored order. Thomas and Samuel knew too much, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. So they killed Thomas and made me disappear by spreading rumors that I was the murderer. Samuel lived because he agreed to stay silent. But when he got old and started talking about the truth, they poisoned him too. Caleb stepped forward, adding the weight of his family name to Eleanor's testimony. My grandfather left documents proving everything she's saying. Names, dates, methods, payments made to assassins. Sheriff Collins, a man everyone knew was bought and paid for by the Cattlemen's Association, tried to dismiss their evidence. The word of a known killer and a boy who's clearly been bewitched means nothing in territorial court. Then let's talk about the other 41 families, Eleanor replied, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor began reading names from her carefully maintained list. The Hendersons, burned alive in their barn. The Mackenzies, poisoned by contaminated well water. The Morrisons, fed spoil meat that caused agonizing deaths. Family after family, murder after murder, all connected by the same pattern of land acquisition. Every property now owned by members of this association, Eleanor said, her eyes scanning the increasingly pale faces in the crowd. Every death ruled accidental by officials who were paid to look the other way. Marcus Cross stood again, his face red with rage. This is preposterous. No one would believe such wild accusations from a deranged woman. They might believe them from me, said a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see Federal Marshal James Morrison walking through the crowd. Behind him came 2 territorial judges and a reporter from the Denver newspaper. Mrs. Blackwood's documentation reached my office 3 weeks ago, Marshal Morrison announced, along with a request from Mr. Ward to investigate these allegations thoroughly. Eleanor looked at Caleb with amazement. You contacted federal authorities? I wanted backup, Caleb explained with a slight smile, in case the local law enforcement proved unreliable. The next hour unfolded like a storm breaking over the territory. Faced with federal investigation and documentation they couldn't deny, the conspiracy began to collapse. Marcus Cross tried to flee, but was arrested at the door. Sheriff Collins attempted to destroy evidence, but found himself in chains alongside the men he had protected for decades. As dawn broke over Montana territory, Eleanor Blackwood stood outside the building where she had finally reclaimed her name and her story. The woman who had spent 12 years hiding in darkness was now free to walk in the light. What happens now? She asked Caleb as they watched the last of conspirators being loaded into wagons for transport to territorial prison. Now we build the life we talked about, Caleb replied, pulling her into an embrace that felt like coming home. We get married, we work the land honestly. We have the children you dreamed of. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears of joy instead of pain for the first time in over a decade. Are you sure the territory is ready for a family like ours? The territory will learn to be ready, Caleb said firmly, and if they don't, we'll teach them. As they walked away from the building together, Eleanor no longer the hidden giant widow, but simply a woman in love with a man who saw her true worth. Both of them understood that sometimes the most important transformations happen not when we discover who we really are, but when we find someone brave enough to love us exactly as we are. The man who had found a hollow sound beneath his barn floor and followed it into darkness had indeed never come back the same. He had become someone capable of extraordinary love, unwavering courage, and the kind of justice that can only come from 2 people choosing to fight the world together. And the giant widow who had spent 12 years believing she was too broken, too dangerous, too different to deserve love had learned that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from hiding our differences, but from finding someone who celebrates them. Their love story became legend throughout the Montana Territory, proof that the most powerful force in the world isn't fear or hatred or greed, but the simple act of seeing someone else's true value when the rest of the world has decided they're worthless. If this story of love conquering impossible odds moved you, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from around the world. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of extraordinary people finding extraordinary love in the most unexpected places. Your support means everything to us, and every subscription helps us bring you stories that remind us all that no one is too different, too broken, or too lost to deserve their happily ever after.